Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, I want to talk about what I read over the last month in January. It was kind of an up and down month for reading for me. There were a couple of disappointments, but a couple of really good books too. So the first book I read was Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. In 1902, this young aspiring poet named Franz Xaver Kappes, who was a student at the military academy in Wiener Neustadt, he learns that Rainer Maria Rilke, who he admires, was a student at this academy 15 years earlier. And so he writes to him and he sends him his poems and he asks Rainer to send him some advice and some feedback. And so this volume collects the 10 letters that Rilke sends to him over the course of a few years from 1903 to 1908. This edition also includes a little, the last like half of this edition, this much of it, is a chronicle of Rilke's life during those years from 1903 to 1908, so like a little biography. So yeah, Kappes initially asks Rilke for feedback on some poems that he's written, like I said. So Rilke's letters are mostly advice about how to live an artistic life, which mostly comes down to how to live an authentic life and how to be true to yourself. I thought this was just all right. It kind of reads like a self-help book in a way, but with better prose. He doesn't use the word mindfulness, obviously, because of when it's written, but he sure talks about it a lot. And that's basically what this is. Like, it reads like a self-help book to me. I finished this on January 1st, which is about 5 weeks before when I'm recording this. And almost none of the specifics of this book have stuck with me. I really don't remember it much at all. None of it stuck with me. I think I would have appreciated this more if I was already familiar with Rilke's work, but this was my first Rilke book. So yeah, maybe I'd be interested in reading more of his work, his actual like poetry, or I think he's written some fiction too. But I wouldn't start here if I was coming into Rilke new again. I wouldn't recommend it as a starting place. I did think it was well, so one thing, I absolutely love the cover on this edition. I think this is a beautiful book. It's very short too, very slim volume. I found this in a Goodwill a couple years ago. And also the translator is Mary D. Herder Norton, who was a co-founder along with her husband of the publishing company W.W. Norton and Company. I thought that was pretty cool. The next book I read was If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. I listened to this on audiobook, narrated by Jefferson Mays, translated by William Weaver. This book was originally published in Italian in 1979, published in English in 1981. So the gimmick with this book is that it's written in the second person. So you, the reader, go into a bookstore and you pick up Italo Calvino's new novel, If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, and then you get home, or you get to your office, or maybe you're so eager you start reading it in the car, and you read the first chapter of this novel that ends on a cliffhanger. And then you go to read the second chapter of this novel, and it's a different chapter. It's a chapter from a different book. And so you're upset about this, and so you return to the bookstore trying to find the right book, to find the next chapter to this book that you started reading. And you meet a young woman there who also has the wrong chapter in her book. And so you both go looking for the next chapter together, and you find what you think is the next chapter, and you sit down to read it, and it's an entirely different story. It's the start of another story. And so you finish that chapter, and it ends on a cliffhanger too. And then you want to go find the next part of that story. And so it kind of goes on and on like this. So every chapter in the book, in the actual book, the one that I am reading, not the one that you, the diegetic character, is reading, the actual Italo Calvino book that I am reading, every chapter is broken up into two parts, essentially, where there's one part where you, the reader, the character, are looking for the next story that you're going to read. And then the second part of the chapter is the story itself, which is always the beginning of a new story. And it ends on some kind of cliffhanger, and you never get the end of the story. So you can almost read this as like a short story collection, where it's a collection of short stories that are all beginnings without endings, and they're linked together by this frame narrative of a reader who's searching for the endings, and he's searching through all of these stories. So I kind of had mixed feelings about this as I was reading it. Like as I was reading it, I either was loving it or I was absolutely hating it. The first couple of chapters I really really liked. I thought they were brilliant. I had a blast reading them. I thought they were great descriptions, great writing about reading, which I love reading. I love reading writing about reading. And I thought this is some of the best of that I've ever read in the first couple of chapters. And I kind of wish that it had just ended there, ended after the second chapter, and it would have been a brilliant short story or novella even. I would have it would have been like one of the best short stories, one of my favorite short stories if that happened. But instead, it keeps going on, and the gimmick kind of gets old pretty quickly, and it kind of just becomes masturbatory, and you're like, Italo, I get it. You can just stop with this now. It does, but even as it keeps going, it changes a little bit. So it starts out being a book about reading, and by the end of it, it's really more a book about writing than it is a book about reading, and a book about the relationship between writers and readers. I do. So one thing that I really liked about it was that it's kind of like a master class in writing fiction, about the technicalities of writing fiction in particular. Like he talks a lot about how to write a scene, how to write characters, how to build tension and stuff like that. These are things that are talked about pretty explicitly in the text. So I thought that was pretty cool. But overall, and I thought the first two chapters I absolutely loved. And throughout, there's some stuff that draws my attention here and there. But overall, I was kind of like, this is it got old after a while. It went on for too long. It should have been shorter. So the next thing I read after that was this Penguin Classics collection of The Awakening and Selected Stories by Kate Chopin. The Awakening is probably her most famous book. Is it a novel? Is it a novella? Who knows? It's a short novel, I think. Maybe it's a novella. I don't know. But anyway, so The Awakening takes place. It opens at this resort on the Gulf Coast in Louisiana called Grand Isle, and the main character, Edna Pontellier, is a young wife and a mother, and she meets this guy Robert at Grand Isle at the resort, and they strike up a friendship that is mostly platonic, but it triggers an awakening in Edna on multiple levels. It's a sexual awakening, but it's more an awakening of self-consciousness and an understanding of her own desires and her own wants, and also an artistic awakening. I mean, in some ways, it's about similar themes as that Rilke book that I was talking about before, Letters to a Young Poet, except that it stuck with me a lot more than the Rilke book did. I'll say that. So thematically, it's very rich. The Awakening and the other stories too, all of them really concern at a base level the role of women in Chopin's society, and how they're pressured into marrying when they're too young and they're inexperienced, and how they're sheltered and isolated from the world. They're stuck in their homes kind of, and how there isn't really a place in society for women who want to do something besides being a wife and a mother, who have other aspirations. But there's also a broader theme about the tension between fulfilling your own desires and living truly and freely for yourself, while also being part of a family and a relationship and a community, and the necessary erasure of some parts of yourself, having to give up some of the things that you want in order to be part of those things. It's really nuanced too. this is one of the things that I really liked about it. It's not that the men in these stories are all really bad and abusive, and so the women have to leave them and find other good men. That's not what happens. Actually, in most of these stories, I think in all of them, the woman doesn't really find another man. That's not what it's about. It's more that the women leave because because they were pressured into marrying when they're too young, and they never knew what it meant to love. They thought that they loved this man, but really it was just they'd never had attention before, and so they married the first person who gave them attention, and because their parents encouraged it, right? Or maybe it's they do love their husband, but they also want more freedom. They want to do things in society. They want to leave the house. They don't want to just be a mother 24/7 and a wife. Or maybe they love their husband, but they also want to love other people too. These are all things that happen in various stories in here. So it's not a black and white thing, and it's not moralizing either. It's a very very kind of nuanced and very modern take on this kind of thing. In terms of writing, the prose is really really good, but still very very readable too. It's not really dense. It's easy to fly through this, especially because it's constructed. All of the stories, The Awakening especially, is constructed really really tightly. Like there isn't a scene out of place in here. And even the short stories are all, I mean, they're short. They're all really, really tightly constructed, all really great. I loved every one of the stories in here. The writing is very psychologically rich. These characters, you get inside their heads and you understand them really, really well. I mean, like Edna in The Awakening, you feel really bad for her, and she makes a lot of bad decisions, but you kind of understand why she's making those decisions, and you sympathize with her. You can really understand what she's feeling. It's also cool. The stories are all of the stories except for one are set in Louisiana, and Chopin does a really great job of building this atmosphere that's like this hot, swampy, muggy Louisiana atmosphere with there's lots of Creole French and Creole dialect in here. It's just all in all, it's a really really it transports you to a specific time and place really really well. It's really great. I highly recommend this book. So the next book that I read was Emma by Jane Austen. I listened to an audiobook narrated by Jenny Agutter on Audible. Emma is the fourth Austen novel that was published in her lifetime. It was published in 1816. Actually, I read on Wikipedia right before this that it was actually published on December 23rd, 1815, but the title page said 1816. So that's a fun fact. So it follows Emma Woodhouse, who is this young girl who is handsome, clever, and rich, and she plays matchmaker with a few other young couples in the neighborhood, and she is unsuccessful. She thinks she knows a lot more than she does, and the novel is kind of her hopefully learning some humility. So this one was a pretty big disappointment to me. I've been reading through all of Austen's works in publication order over the last couple months. So far I've read Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Mansfield Park, and I've loved all of them. Like I think of Austen as one of my favorite authors now, just based on those books. But this one didn't captivate me anywhere near as much as those ones did. I think largely because the novel really closely follows and is focalized through Emma, and Emma herself is a very unlikable character. And the other problem is that none of the other characters really feel developed in the way that other Austen characters do to me. So one of the things that I love the most about Austen is her minor characters are usually so brilliantly done. She's a brilliant psychologist, and she writes amazing characters. I mean, Mrs. Norris is the best villain in English literature. and just so many memorable characters from all of her other works that I've read. Um, but this book, there weren't really many. Emma is the only character that really stood out, and Emma is very, very annoying and very, very unlikable. So yeah, I found it kind of difficult, and it also, yeah, I didn't find it very funny. I didn't laugh once reading this book, whereas usually I find Austen really funny. I felt like the wit and the satire was just toned way down in this book. It almost feels like, to me, one thing that it did really well is it really felt the most out of all of her books like it captured the experience of being a teenager. And I think that might also be part of what I didn't like about it, because I'm I didn't like being a teenager when I was a teenager, and I don't particularly ever enjoy reading things about teenagers. So that may be part of why I didn't like it. I think maybe younger readers would identify with this book more and would like it more. Not that I think you have to identify with a book to like it. Um, I think maybe I just didn't like it because of this. Anyway, I also think my negative experience was partly compounded by the audiobook I listened to, which was set up really, really strangely. It was divided into 12 chapters that were an hour and 15 minutes each, and they would just like arbitrarily split those chapters in sometimes in like the middle of a paragraph. It seemed like they weren't connected to the actual book chapters at all, which was really, really weird, because I usually, when I listen to an audiobook, when I start listening, I usually like hit the back button and start at the beginning of a chapter. Even if I've already listened to 5 or 10 minutes of it or whatever, I'll go back and listen to those 5 or 10 minutes again, and that helps me get back into it. But I couldn't do that on this one. So yeah, I have this Penguin Classics edition. I plan on at some point rereading it in this physical edition, and maybe my opinion will change a little bit. But at this point, I gotta say that it's far and away my least favorite Austen that I've read. So the final book that I read this month was Hard Times by Charles Dickens. This one really, really surprised me. I felt the urge to read Charles Dickens in the beginning of January, and what I really wanted to read was Bleak House, this old copy of Bleak House that I found at a Goodwill probably 10 years ago. That's pretty cool. It's got illustrations in it. It's a cool old copy. And after doing some research online, I realized that it was abridged. So I went back to my shelf, and the only other Charles Dickens that I own that I haven't read already was Hard Times. So that's what I picked up. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I had to run and do some stuff, so the lighting may have changed. It's definitely a lot darker outside now. So where was I? The Hard Times. I picked this up kind of reluctantly, because what I really wanted to read was Bleak House, but this was the only one I had on my shelf that I hadn't read by Dickens. And I thought that this was going to just be a simple kind of like finger wagging at the bad industrialists kind of novel, which is okay. Like I'm totally on board with that. But I didn't think it was going to be like all that complex or anything. But it was actually a really, really good novel. Had a really broad range of themes that it touches upon. Um, yeah, it's really good. So it kind of follows a few different intersecting plot lines. So you're following Tom and Louisa Gradgrind, who are siblings who have been raised with this utilitarian education by their father, Mr. Gradgrind, who is kind of like an education reformer, maybe a utilitarian educator. And he also becomes a member of parliament eventually. So you're following them. You're following Sissy Jupe, who is abandoned by her father, who was in a traveling circus, and she ends up living with the Gradgrinds. And then you also have Mr. Bounderby, who's a friend of Mr. Gradgrind, and he's a mill owner. And we also follow Stephen Blackpool, who is a mill worker. And so you've got all of this range of characters across different social classes, different age groups, different generations are all coming together with these intersecting plot lines. And that's really all I want to say about the plot. I don't want to give the plot away, but it has a good plot. So it absolutely does contain a good bit of finger wagging at industrialists, but there's so much more going on with it too. I think that even beyond the critique of industrialism, um, the bigger thing that it's talking about is the significance of early childhood education and the negative effects that it can have, that a bad education can have on an adult, a bad childhood education. Um, so Tom and Louisa are both brought up under Mr. Gradgrind's utilitarian education system, which is all about the only thing from the earliest time of a child is born, the only thing that they can learn is facts. And they're not allowed to deal with anything imaginary. They're not allowed to think, to be creative, or to come up with ideas. They're only supposed to memorize facts. And like the opening sentence of the book is a speech from Mr. Gradgrind to a classroom saying, now what I want is facts. Teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. This is the principle on which I bring up my own children, and this is the principle on which I bring up these children. Stick to facts, sir. And yeah, so that's the education that Tom and Louisa had, and it has very, very negative effects on their adult psychology that are explored in this book. So that's one thing that it's doing. But there's also a criticism of the negative effects of mass production in this book, about the way that it causes a uniformity in the population and in the ways that people think related to the education as well. So everyone is thinking the same way. People are treated as statistics. And this is all kind of a byproduct of this economy based on manufacturing. There's also there's a moral criticism of utilitarianism and of industrialists and mill owners. There's a criticism of the free market economics that enables or even encourages the utilitarian philosophy and the kind of immoral behaviors of the mill owners that encourages these people and rewards them for treating people as statistics and for acting in immoral ways. There's a criticism of unjust divorce laws. There's also some stuff about addiction and suicide in here that's handled in a really kind of modern way, really sympathetically, really unmoralizing. It's really, I was surprised at how well he handled those topics. So yeah, this was just a really fun, really, really good read. I highly recommend it. It's even, so I was reading this at the same time that I was listening to Emma, and even though Emma is written 30 years before this, Dickens' language, Austen's language actually sounds a lot more modern than Dickens. Dickens has a really, really interesting style. It's almost like, it almost sounds archaic compared to his other Victorian contemporaries, but it's still very readable. But it feels like it's drawing from like Sterne and Chaucer a lot more than his other contemporaries are. It's kind of, it has this weird like out of time sound to it. It's really cool, and his characters are all amazing. He's a brilliant writer of characters. So yeah, this was a great book. So my standout book of the month is kind of a toss-up between The Awakening and Hard Times. I loved both of them. But I think I have to give it to The Awakening, just because I really was not expecting this to be as good as it was, and it really blew me away. And even the short stories I loved. I want to read all of her short stories now. I think that this novel, I think this novel and the stories were all brilliant. This is, if I had read this last year, it easily would have been in one of my top 5 books of the year. This is one of the books that reminds you of like why you love reading. It was really, really good. So yeah, I highly recommend The Awakening and Chopin's short stories as well. And I highly recommend Hard Times as well. I loved that book too. So yeah, I'm listening to Pogue Mahone by Patrick McCabe on audiobook. And I am reading Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu. I hope I pronounced that right. On my Kindle. And I'm reading, I'm reading The Rings of Saturn by W.G. Sebald as a physical book. So I will talk a little bit more about those next month. And hopefully I'll have read a few more things as well. And yeah, that's all, folks. I will see you next month. Let me know in the comments below what you've been reading or what thoughts you have about the stuff I've been reading, or if you have any recommendations that you think I would like. I'd appreciate all of those things. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.